As you may have already noticed, Unit 5 has quite a bit of overlap with Unit 4, particularly in the field of social revolutions. So we read about social revolutions, the Cuban Revolution, La Via Chilena, or the Chilean way of accomplishing a revolutionary change in that nation. We've also touched upon what was going on in Guatemala during the 10 years of spring, as it's been referred to. We're going to continue talking about those themes and those major trends in Latin America, but this time we're going to look at how those fit into larger global issues and pressures, particularly how US foreign policy during the Cold War shaped social revolutions, their outcomes, and the responses to them. Overall, as you've already read about in the written introduction to this unit, US foreign policy was very negative toward anything that even remotely looked Marxist in quote unquote our backyard. So there was this notion that as American policymakers and looking at US foreign policy, we had not only the duty but also the right to intervene in Latin American nations and nations in the Western Hemisphere in order to wage the Cold War, if we want to think of it that way. So just to think about some of the terms that you will need to define as you complete the readings for this unit in order to answer the guiding question. The guiding question, of course, is how did Cold War foreign policies and and the expansion of neoliberal global economics impact issues of human and civil rights across Latin America? So, of course, we need to understand what the Cold War was. The introduction in Wood and Alexander to Chapter 10 deals with that in quite a bit of detail. It talks about the Cold War as this global conflict between what were then termed first world nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, and whoever was on each side. So the world was essentially polarized between the two world superpowers. In that context, there were a lot of proxy wars that were waged. The kind of most infamous of which is the Vietnam War, in which first the French and then the United States became involved in a war for independence. Well, it was a war of the Vietnamese against the French for their independence, that then became part of this global Cold War conflict, as instead, from the US perspective, a war to prevent the spread of communism. That's how events like the Guatemalan Revolution, 1944 to 1954, what was going on in Bolivia, in Cuba, in Chile, and even in places like Argentina and Brazil, all were kind of seen through these Cold War lenses of we must defeat communism at all costs, even if that means that we support very brutal authoritarian dictatorships in these nations. Even if we upend democratic representative systems in these nations. And that is what happened over and over, as we saw with the Guatemalan case in particular. So there's just a little context for that. Neoliberal global economics is the other term that you'll need to define for this particular guiding question. That one's dealt with in more detail in Chapter 11 in Wood and Alexander. And I think there are some pretty good definitions there. Essentially, we need to think critically about what is meant when policymakers talk about quote-unquote free trade. Free trade is very different than fair trade. Free trade tends to benefit those who have capital, who have power, and allows for larger profits, often at the expense of people in nations like the Latin American countries that we've been studying that have a lot of natural resources, and from the global north, as we've begun to refer to it, rather than the first world. From that perspective, the global south tends to have quote-unquote cheap labor. Usually that means people are not paid enough. They are not provided with the same kinds of benefits and guarantees that employees, laborers would be provided with in the global north. All of this fits, though, into the rubric of what we studied a little while ago as classical liberalism. So the liberal ideals of the 19th century have kind of come back again in the form of neoliberalism. And even though these are defined as liberal kinds of things, they would fit in the current US political spectrum more with the right than with the left. So pay attention again to what these things mean in different times, in different places, and then how all of this impacts human rights. Chapter 13 in the Wood and Alexander book is brand new for this edition. There wasn't a chapter on environmental justice until this edition, so I'm glad to see that because there have been a lot of environmental activists across Latin America, several of whom are discussed in that chapter, who have been repressed and even assassinated in the last few decades. And again, part of that has to do with how neoliberal agendas tend to work against environmental justice and efforts to promote environmental preservation and stability. And also, this all comes back to the issue of self-determination for Latin Americans and what are the best ways to ensure better equality, because inequality runs rampant in this region, as we've discussed over and over. So how can we address, or how can Latin Americans, I should say, address those issues within this global context, and how can they promote civil rights and human rights? I'm going to reach for Wood and Alexander here because I wanted to, here at the end of this intro video, point out one of the questions for analysis in chapter 13. It's on page 315. These are questions, again, that hopefully will help you and have helped you as you've read. They're not things that you've been assigned. But the third one on 315 says, what examples of collective action do you see in this chapter? Do you see any similarities or differences from the acts of resistance analyzed in chapter 9 on social revolution? And so we need to think about then the ways that social revolution, in terms of its goals for social justice and dealing with the problems that I've just mentioned, how those have continued even after the revolutionary movements have sort of died out in other forms. So in efforts to protect the water supply of different nations. And if you do the Even the Rain extra credit film opportunity that if I haven't posted yet, I will, that discusses the issue in Cochabamba. It was called the Cochabamba Water Wars of the early 2000s, in which the people of Cochabamba had their access to water taken away from them because it was privatized. Water as a resource was privatized in a way that made it inaccessible to people. And so again, this question is, what are these things that we should see as basic human rights, such as access to water? How are they impacted by all of these larger trends and issues? So hopefully that's a good example to help you think about this and to help you think about the continuities between Units 4 and 5. I look forward to seeing your posts and learning from your insights on all of this.